They have literally banned American products, alcohol. Okay, that is an irritant. I think we've clearly signaled to Canada that before we really do anything else, fix alcohol.
Pete Hoekstra tried to warn Canada. Instead, he may have just exposed how badly the United States still needs Canada. Because during his latest public interview complaining about Canadian boycotts, tariffs, and trade tensions, the U.S. ambassador ended up admitting something Washington has been trying very hard not to say too loudly. America still needs Canadian minerals, a lot of them, and that is becoming a serious problem for Trump's pressure strategy against Ottawa.
So, there's a list of those things that we have in place. They're readily available. Obviously, the Canadian government knows them.
The latest tension escalated after U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra publicly criticized Canada over a growing list of economic and political disputes that have been building throughout Trump's second term. During the interview, Hoekstra complained about Canadian provinces pulling American alcohol products from store shelves and criticized Canadian political leaders for encouraging consumers to buy Canadian products and reduce travel to the United States. At one point, he openly vented his frustration, saying, "It's now been 11, 12, 13 months that we've been working on this. That is a huge irritant. I think America, on that one, we've about had it." But then the conversation moved into much more strategic territory. Hoekstra started discussing critical minerals, and that is where the interview suddenly became far more revealing. While trying to project confidence, he admitted the United States is actively investing in Canadian mining projects and urgently wants long-term access to Canadian critical minerals and rare earth supply chains. He described Canadian minerals as important for both American economic security and national security. That mattered because it directly collided with the broader Trump administration message that America can simply pressure Canada economically without consequences. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. Washington was simultaneously insisting America does not need Canada, while also admitting it urgently wants Canadian minerals for strategic industries. That is not a minor inconsistency. That is the entire problem. The most important thing about Hoekstra's interview was not the alcohol complaints. It was the frustration underneath the mineral discussion. Because this no longer sounded like routine diplomacy. It sounded like Washington realizing the United States cannot easily separate itself from Canadian resource supply chains while simultaneously escalating political pressure against Ottawa. The United States is now racing to secure supply chains for lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, uranium, and rare earth minerals as competition with China intensifies. Those materials are directly tied to EV production, military systems, semiconductors, AI infrastructure, and advanced energy storage, and Canada happens to sit on enormous reserves of them. That is why Hoekstra spent so much time discussing mining partnerships, investment cooperation, and American participation in Canadian mineral projects. At one point, he even admitted Washington was disappointed Canada did not fully join a US-led critical minerals initiative. That line revealed far more than he probably intended. Because if Washington truly believed Canada had no leverage, there would be no frustration about Ottawa refusing to fully align itself with American mineral strategy. But there clearly is frustration, and it is growing.
For more than a year, Trump's second administration has leaned heavily on tariff threats, reshoring pressure, and economic nationalism to force trading partners into alignment. Canada has been one of the main targets. But minerals are exposing the limits of that strategy. Because unlike consumer products, strategic minerals cannot simply be replaced overnight. American defense manufacturers cannot suddenly relocate entire rare earth supply chains in 6 months. EV battery projects cannot function without long-term mineral contracts. Refineries, processors, and industrial facilities are built around sourcing agreements that often take years to develop. And Canada is deeply embedded inside those systems. The United States still imports massive amounts of Canadian oil. American agriculture still depends heavily on Canadian potash. Auto manufacturing across Ontario and Michigan still functions like one integrated industrial corridor, moving parts across the border every single day. Now, critical minerals are becoming another pressure point, which means every escalation creates another contradiction. Washington wants Canada economically dependent enough to follow American strategic priorities. But the U.S. industrial system is simultaneously dependent on Canadian resources. That makes aggressive pressure tactics much harder to sustain long-term, especially while global supply chains remain unstable and countries around the world compete for secure access to strategic minerals.
What makes this situation even more uncomfortable for Washington is that Ottawa has clearly noticed the shift. Mark Carney's government has spent months positioning Canada as the stable supplier inside an increasingly unstable global trade environment, and investors are responding. Canada has been expanding mineral discussions with allies outside the United States, strengthening relationships with Asian and European buyers, and promoting itself as a reliable long-term source of strategic resources during a period of growing geopolitical fragmentation. That strategy did not appear overnight. It accelerated after repeated tariff threats and trade disputes convinced many Canadian policymakers that overdependence on Washington had become risky. Hoekstra's interview may have reinforced that concern more effectively than any speech from Carney ever could, because the ambassador sounded frustrated not simply that Canada was resisting pressure, but that Canada now has enough leverage to resist in the first place. And the market understands this. Mining companies are watching where governments are placing strategic investment. Battery manufacturers are watching which countries look politically stable. Pension funds and infrastructure investors are watching where long-term industrial policy appears predictable. Canada increasingly looks like the calmer side of North America. That perception matters, especially when billions of dollars in mining and energy investment are involved.
Even the alcohol dispute started revealing larger problems underneath the surface. At first, removing American liquor from Canadian shelves looked symbolic, a political gesture, a consumer protest. But more than a year later, American officials are still publicly complaining about it. That tells you the economic pressure is real. U.S. alcohol producers previously exported hundreds of millions of dollars worth of products into Canada annually. Several American states tied to whiskey and spirits production were already facing pressure from trade uncertainty and slowing international demand. Then came the Canadian restrictions and Buy Canadian campaigns. Now, Washington is openly acknowledging the damage. That is important politically because it weakens the narrative that Canada's response was meaningless. Clearly, it was not meaningless. Otherwise, Pete Hoekstra would not still be talking about liquor shelves 13 months later, while simultaneously asking for deeper mineral cooperation. That combination created one of the most revealing moments of the entire interview. America was trying to pressure Canada economically while also asking Canada for strategic partnership at the exact same time. And that balancing act is getting harder. Right now, the Canada-US relationship is entering a strange phase. Trade is still enormous. Energy still flows across the border. Auto plants still depend on integrated supply chains. But politically, the tone is changing fast. Washington is becoming increasingly frustrated that Canada is not responding to pressure the way previous governments might have. And Ottawa appears increasingly comfortable building alternatives. The unresolved question now is whether the Trump administration can keep escalating economic pressure while still depending on Canadian resources for its industrial and national security strategy. Because Pete Hoekstra may have just revealed the central weakness in Washington's approach. The harder America pushes Canada, the more valuable Canada's leverage becomes.
Algoma Steel has signed a binding memorandum of understanding with South Korean shipbuilder Hanwha Ocean to the tune of $345 million. The signing ceremony took place earlier today with Ontario Trade Minister Vic Fedeli in attendance. It's predicated on the South Korean business winning the federal contract to build a fleet of submarines for the Canadian military.
Canada has just pulled off one of the most significant industrial moves of the year. Algoma Steel secured a $345 million partnership tied directly to South Korea's bid to build Canada's next fleet of submarines, a deal that doesn't just revive Ontario steel, but shifts the balance of power in North America's supply chains. At a time when Donald Trump believes he can squeeze Canada with escalating tariffs, regulatory threats, and geopolitical pressure, Ottawa has quietly taken a critical piece of the defense industrial puzzle out of America's hands and anchored it inside a new Canada-Korea ecosystem. This is the clearest signal yet that Canada has stopped playing by Washington's script.
The agreement between Algoma Steel and Hanwha Ocean commits up to $345 million for the construction of a structural steel beam mill in Sault Ste. Marie if South Korea wins the contract to deliver up to 12 Canadian Patrol Submarine Project vessels. This investment immediately changes the trajectory of Canada's heavy industry landscape. For Algoma, it is a path to restore lost jobs and rebuild long-term industrial capacity. For Hanwha, it is an entry point into one of the most strategically important defense procurements Canada has undertaken in decades. The deal fits seamlessly into Ottawa's Buy Canadian policy, which requires major foreign bidders to produce real domestic industrial benefits. Canada isn't simply buying ships, it is restructuring its own industrial base. And this arrives just as Canada debates another procurement question, the choice between the US F-35 and Sweden's Gripen. If the F-35 ties Canada even deeper into US dependency, the Gripen offers more control over training, maintenance, and intellectual property. In many ways, that debate mirrors today's steel decision. Canada is choosing diversification, flexibility, and sovereignty over automatic alignment with Washington.
In early 2026, Washington's pressure campaign shifted into a new phase. After Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he warned of a fractured global system and urged middle-power democracies to diversify their economic ties, the White House reacted with visible irritation. Carney's remarks were interpreted as a direct challenge to Washington's habit of using trade as leverage, and Trump wasted no time responding. He first threatened Canada with a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods should Ottawa move forward with deeper engagement with China. Then he turned eastward, targeting South Korea with a sudden tariff hike, raising duties on Korean autos, lumber, and pharmaceuticals from the negotiated 15% ceiling to 25%, a punitive response to Seoul's slow movement on a U.S. trade framework. The message was unmistakable. If a partner did not align with America's political priorities, economic pressure would follow. And the escalation continued. On January 29th, Trump pushed the confrontation into unprecedented territory by announcing plans to hit Canadian aerospace exports with 50% tariffs, while simultaneously threatening to decertify Bombardier's Global Express aircraft unless Canada aligned its certification decisions with U.S. demands. It was a stunning blend of regulatory coercion and trade retaliation, directed squarely at one of Canada's most important high-tech sectors. These moves came against a broader backdrop of U.S. pressure over Arctic security and Greenland policy, but the real pattern was simpler. Washington was squeezing both Canada and South Korea at the exact moment the two countries were deepening defense industrial cooperation. That is what makes the Algoma-Hanwha steel deal so strategically powerful. Instead of caving to tariff threats, Canada responded by re-engineering its supply chain, tying a major defense procurement to domestic steel production and a long-term partnership with a country that is also facing U.S. pressure. The deal isn't just an industrial investment, it is a structural countermove against Washington's leverage. By shifting submarine-grade steel production into Canada, Ottawa reduces the number of economic choke points the United States can exploit and strengthens an alternative network that connects Canadian workers and Korean capital outside of Washington's reach.
Washington has long treated Canada's industrial base as an extension of its own, assuming that Canadian shipyards, steel mills, and aerospace manufacturers would ultimately depend on American suppliers. That assumption no longer holds. With this deal, Canada begins shifting core components of its defense supply chain back home. High-strength steel for submarine hulls will no longer be exposed to American tariffs or political uncertainty. And the deeper Canada builds this domestic capacity, the less influence Washington retains over Canadian industrial decisions. Just as the Gripen proposal challenges the idea that Canadian air power must be American-built, the Algoma-Hanwha plan challenges the belief that North American naval production must flow through U.S. supply lines. Carney has been explicit. Canada must become the customer of its own economic strength. This deal is the clearest practical example of that philosophy. Instead of purchasing foreign hardware and accepting foreign dependencies, Canada is using procurement to expand domestic capabilities, worker skills, industrial output, and supply chain resilience. It is a shift from passive procurement to active statecraft, and it represents a Canada that sees industrial sovereignty not as an aspiration, but as a strategic requirement.
For decades, the United States assumed that major Canadian defense programs, especially submarines, would naturally fall under American influence, whether through materials, certification, or intellectual property. But Canada's pivot toward Korea signals a different future. South Korea is emerging as a global powerhouse in advanced shipbuilding, and it is willing to invest heavily in Canada to win the contract. For Trump, this is not just a commercial loss, it is a loss of leverage. Tariffs no longer push Canada back into the American orbit, when Canada is actively building economic partnerships that bypass Washington. Every investment that strengthens Canadian autonomy weakens Washington's assumption of Canadian compliance.
The Algoma-Hanwha deal is not a reaction, it is preparation. Canada is designing a future where critical inputs for national defense cannot be disrupted by U.S. politics, U.S. tariffs, or U.S. regulatory threats. If the F-35 debate hinted at Canada's desire for more sovereignty in the air, and if Carney's Davos speech signaled a philosophical break from the old dependency model, then this steel mill is the material proof that the shift is real. Canada isn't just diversifying partners. Canada is positioning itself to withstand pressure and even outmaneuver it.
Viewed narrowly, a $345 million steel investment may look like industrial policy, but in the context of tariff threats, aerospace retaliation, and a U.S. government pressuring both Canada and Korea at the same time, it becomes something much larger. If Hanwha wins the submarine contract, Canada will not only receive new underwater capability, it will gain a strengthened industrial base, a domestic steel source insulated from tariffs, and a long-term partnership that Washington cannot easily disrupt. And the question now is unavoidable. If Canada can reclaim steel, diversify its air power, and build submarines outside the U.S. orbit, what exactly is left for Trump to leverage?